Well, I became a film scholar completely by accident. Possibly, I might even say by misfortune. Again, I mean, it's rather, you might say, just as I was arguing that Marx's work was an emanation of a particular moment in history where various things were happening, that was certainly the same for me. And I'm a product of my own historical moment. And if it hadn't been for the fact that I just coincided with that, I would never have become a film scholar. How shall I describe this? So I think in the first instance, my background of going to the cinema in the 1960s and seeing all these Hollywood movies of the studio system period, and some others, Rossellini, and then when the new wave came along, particularly Godard, but really the founding cinephilia, as they say nowadays, was based on studio system cinema. Collecting the films, identifying the directors, following the Cahiers du Cinéma, going over to Paris, going to the Cinémathèque, seeing what they were showing in the little cinemas around the left bank, etc., etc. And it was only retrospectively when I started to put it like this, only retrospectively, when quite suddenly I was influenced by feminism, I saw the films in a different way. So, as I've said quite often before, films that had moved me, touched me, absorbed me, left me sitting back in my seat, and rather than watching with absorption, watching, looking, and beginning to analyze. So scenes that I might have thought were very touching now seemed more irritating. It was almost an unexpected and undesired shift in a way of seeing. It just happened. And that's a change in history and ideology, which, as I say, wasn't perhaps particularly anything to do with me, but I was just there at that moment. And then because I started reading Freud in my women's reading group and became very interested in how Freud, even if he had misogynist blind spots, could be very useful to a feminist analysis of sexuality, the drives, the structure of desire, and so on. I found I could put Freud and Hollywood movies together in such a way that they just fitted each other and spoke to each other, and all I really had to do was put the words together. And that was quite fun. I enjoyed that. But then there was no film studies. This was in the mid-70s. Film was studied in art schools a bit, and but then by the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, film studies kind of took off as a new subject in the universities. So eventually I got a job. And that's it, really. I sometimes wonder what, if I hadn't fallen into this by accident, what kind of a life I would have had. But I don't think I'd have been an academic because I didn't do very well at university. I studied history at Oxford, and it was too difficult for me. But I loved history, but it was very hard. I couldn't. There was too much of it. And I think that was one of the ways in which the women's movement and feminism helped me, because it gave me an angle, a perspective, a way of thinking about ideas and things And the fact that I applied it to movies rather than history was probably a case of discretion being the better part of valor. It's not such a difficult discipline. But, so that's what happened. But I mean, I think I also had I had another shift in vision, which I describe in Death 24 Times a Second, when I started looking at some of these old movies again and realizing that playing with the remote control, stopping them, repeating sequences, slowing it down, etc., 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 all you could do, could suddenly make the film a different work, and things in it could be found that hadn't been seen before, but also you could discover cinema as such that wasn't so regulated by narrative and narrativity. As Roland Barthes said, it's impossible to be pensive about the cinema in the same way as in the still photograph, because it moves too fast and it's domesticated by fiction. But once you could break down the grip of fiction, you could find so many other kind of kaleidoscopic ways of looking at the film image that it could become something slightly different. Well, that was pretty accidental too. Yes. I always feel I've fallen into things rather than, but certainly an important aspect of the visual pleasure narrative cinema essay was a belief that a new cinema was around the corner, or was closer than around the corner, and that there'd be a new cinema of women and new ways of thinking about cinema and so on and so on. And that the background in avant-garde and experimental film was really important and very illuminating. And so the new films by women that we were beginning to see in the early to mid-70s, to cite Yvonne Reyna, Lives of Performers, film about a woman who, Chantal Ackerman, I saw Hotel Monterey, and then of course Jeanne Dielman, but that was after we'd made our first film. Joyce Wieland, Valley Export from Vienna, her film Invisible Adversaries was really amazing. And there were others. So there was a sense that there was, and these were feature films, big films, and there was a sense that there was another cinema. And then my former husband, Peter Wollen, got a job at the University of Northwestern outside Chicago, and there his boss, the head of the Department of Film, Radio, Film and Television, said, come on, if you're so interested in this new cinema and experimental film, there's a whole cupboard full of film equipment sitting there. Make a film. So that's how we made our first film. Then when we got back to London the following year, the experimental film scene in London had completely taken off and was very, very vital, and also managed to keep a dialogue going across the different kinds of political film, from extreme abstraction to agitprop. And that was a very inspiring context to work in, which was made possible, again, by the fact that there was money made available from the government money, there was support from the British Film Institute, support from the Arts Council, and a context in which there was film as just as, or almost just as important as film was writing conferences. The conferences began, festivals, Edinburgh Film Festival, the seminars that Screen set up around the Edinburgh Film Festival, the dialogues that emerged out of that period. It's so, I think, now important to remember that the films get remembered because they're still around, but the little magazines, the essays, the conferences, the seminars, the day schools, all those kinds of dialogues can just disappear into the past, unless someone bothers to dig them up again, of course, as a historical research project. And now in academia, anything's possible. Well, when I collaborated with Peter Wollen, of course, it was very clear that we were making essay films by and large. And so they were an extension of our theoretical work. As the climate changed and it became impossible, really, after the Thatcher period, to make these kind of crazy essayistic films, you had to move more into the mainstream, which I didn't really want to do. And we tried making one last feature film for Channel 4, which didn't really work. And then Peter went on to make his amazing film, Friendship's Death, that he did on his own. With Mark, it was a more question of documentary topics that came up and seemed suitable as a film topic. So when we made our film Disgraced Monuments together, Mark was living in Toronto and working with an artists' co-op called Public, which aimed to get artists' work into public spaces. So it was about public space and art. So clearly, when the old Soviet monuments started coming down, Mark was fascinated about these transformations of the ideology of public space. And he was in London and we had lunch together, and I said, well, that sounds as though you could make it into a little documentary. And he immediately applied for money from Canada Council and got it. So we made this short documentary, which was then finished by Channel 4, called Disgraced Monuments, which was about, we shot in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and was about the changing history of monumental art from the coming of communism until the fall of communism, which we were doing as outsiders, you know, again, probably really naive. I often think, you know, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. But the film was shown recently in Moscow, just for a conference about how do you deal with history. But then the next project was something that had been very dear to my heart for a long time, which was to do with the history of Iraq and the absolute catastrophe of the Iraq War. And I'd wanted to do a portrait of a friend of mine, an Iraqi, called Faisal Abdullah. And I said to Mark, I'll just, you know, get a little camera and I'll just talk to Faisal. He said, no, you can't do that. You'll make a mess of it. I'm going to get my good red camera and a sound person and we'll do it properly. So we turned that into a 25-minute portrait of Faisal giving a portrait of his brother Kamil and telling his story. And that's something I'd quite like to go back to and expand at some point. But the other project I have with Mark is something much more to do with thinking about cinema and thinking about images of women and so on. because I'm so stereotyped as an images of women person that if I'm going to get a movie off the ground, people always say, oh yes, the male gaze, Laura Mulvey. Peter Wollen was always, from really quite early on, serious about his cinephilia. So when he was involved with reconfiguring New Left Review in the early 60s, and what would be in the cultural section, he contributed his first essays on the Hollywood directors that he was interested in. And then when he went to work at the BFI in the education department, he started very, very seriously launching semiotics with a series of seminars which were never really published, but he knew from that early moment that he was interested in theorizing film from the point of view of semiotics, which then led to his book, Science and Meaning in the Cinema, that came out in 1969. And then he went on to write his two influential essays about the avant-garde, the Vent d'Est and Counter-Cinema about Godard, and the two avant-gardes about the history of the avant-garde. And he had, of course, also been interested in the avant-garde long before I got interested in the avant-garde. So during the 60s, he'd been involved with people who were going back to the experimental aesthetics of the early 1920s Soviet Union and the art that dated from there, which was a big influence on how people were beginning to reconsider and reconfigure an avant-garde in the 1960s. So he was very much part of that movement. Well, I just think in terms of the film studies, the days when film studies started, institutions weren't nearly so institutionalized. They hadn't gone through the neoliberal mill, as it were, which has put so many kinds of restrictions. They're much freer. And that wasn't just to do with film studies. I think that was to do with the way in which academic institutions could exist as intellectual institutions rather than as production lines. That seems really unfair, but there's much more of an emphasis now, I think, on institutionalization and less anarchism than there might have been in the old days. I think that's very, very hard on young people to be under that continual pressure from the earliest days of your career, to have to think about intervening in the public space and public dialogue, even if you're not ready for it. It's all turned into much more of a, as I said, a production line, which it used to be. And I mean, those of us in the UK, at any rate, in early film studies, none of us had a PhD. Well, when I say none of us, not Peter Wollen, nor me, nor Ian Christie, nor Victor Perkins, all the people who were in the first wave of Jim Hillier. There wasn't such a thing. So that whole massive question of the PhD didn't exist, which was very liberating. Lots of us had just done very badly in our original disciplines and then kind of gone to the movies to recover, and then suddenly found it turned into a career. I do think that the pressing questions of today are perhaps, I mean, I think cinema can kind of look after itself. There'll always be people who will be researching, studying, and illuminating the history of the cinema, which after all is very short. There's not a lot of it. But in a sense, the problem now is what would we do with the vast accumulation of data and the production of images out of nothing into everywhere. And what does that mean, and how do we start to analyze that? It seems to me to be questions in which our traditional aesthetics don't really teach us much. But then I think that's wrong. We must, as it were, struggle to try and think through our experience of analyzing ideology, analyzing aesthetics, analyzing moving image technology, and so on. And rather than being intimidated by the scale of the problems now, finding ways of turning it into discourse and turning it into something that can be satisfactorily discussed and exchanged.